Do you ever feel like you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing, but somehow you still don't feel like yourself? You go to work, you take care of the people that you love, you handle your responsibilities, you keep moving forward. And yet, somewhere underneath all of it, there's this feeling that something isn't right. You can't quite explain it. You just know you don't feel connected to yourself anymore. And maybe you've started calling that feeling being lost. But what if you're not lost at all? What if you've just spent so much of your life becoming who you needed to be that you've forgotten to ask who you actually are? That's what I want to talk about today, because the return isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you are. Because when you believe you're lost, you immediately start looking for something outside of yourself to tell you where to go next. You look for the right answer, the right career, the right relationship, the right direction, the right version of yourself. And you start asking everybody else what they think you should do. And sometimes you consume so much information trying to figure yourself out that you become even more confused, because somewhere underneath all of that searching is a much deeper question. Who am I really? Not who am I supposed to be? Not who does everyone else need me to be? Not who have I spent years becoming? But who am I when I stop performing all of those roles? That question is where the return begins. Because there's a lot of people walking around right now who aren't necessarily lost. They've just become disconnected from themselves, and there is a difference. Think about how early we start learning who we're supposed to be. You don't come into this world with a fully formed identity. You learn, you observe, you adapt. You figure out very quickly what gets a response from the people around you. Maybe you learn that being quiet keeps things peaceful. Maybe you learn that being helpful gets you approval. Maybe you learn that being successful makes people proud of you. Maybe you learn that you need to be strong. Maybe you have learned that you shouldn't ask for too much. Or maybe you've learned to keep everybody happy. Maybe you become the responsible one, the funny one, the successful one, the easygoing one, the one who doesn't need anything. And none of this necessarily happens consciously. You don't sit down one day and say, okay, this is the identity I'm going to build for myself. You simply respond to life. You learn what works, you repeat it, and eventually those patterns become so familiar that you stop seeing them as patterns. You just call them me. That's the interesting part. Something you learned can eventually feel like something you are. And then you grow up. You build a life. You make decisions. You create relationships. You develop a career. You take on responsibilities. You become really good at being the person you've learned to be. And for a while, that might work until one day something changes. Maybe nothing dramatic happens. Maybe your life looks pretty fine from the outside, but inside, something feels different. Something feels off. The things that used to motivate you don't seem to matter in the same way anymore. And the goals you spent years chasing suddenly feel strangely empty. Certain conversations don't interest you anymore. Certain environments drain you. Certain relationships begin to feel different. And you might not even know why. You just know something doesn't fit anymore. And this is where people often say, I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel lost. I don't know what I want. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. But what if nothing is wrong with you? Just going to put that out there. What if nothing is wrong with you? What if you're simply becoming aware of the distance between the person you've learned to be and the person you are becoming? And that's a very different conversation, because if you believe you're lost, your instinct is to find a new direction. But if you're disconnected from yourself, the first step isn't necessarily finding a new direction, it's reconnecting. And that's a completely different process. You don't have to immediately quit your job. You don't have to leave your relationship. You don't have to move across the country. You don't have to reinvent yourself. And you don't need another personality. You don't need another identity. You need space to actually hear yourself. That's harder than it sounds, though, because most of us carry a lot of noise. Other people's expectations, old beliefs, old habits, old fears, old definitions of success, old ideas about what makes us worthy. And when you've spent enough time listening to all of that, your own voice can become difficult to hear. This is why I call this the return. Not because we're going backward. We're not trying to return to childhood. We're not trying to find some perfect version of ourselves that existed before life happened. Not at all. And this isn't about some mystical version of you hiding somewhere waiting to be discovered. I'm talking about something much more practical. The return is the process of becoming aware of what you've learned and what you've adapted to, what you've taken on, and what you're still carrying. And then beginning to make conscious choices about what actually belongs to you now. That's the difference, because there are things you learned that still serve you. There are things that you were taught that you genuinely believe. There are values you inherited that you've consciously chosen to keep. And there are other things you may have been carrying simply because you've never stopped to question them. And the goal isn't to reject everything. The goal is to see it. Because once you can see something, you now have a choice. And this is where the journey gets very uncomfortable. Because sometimes the identity you've outgrown is the identity that built your life. And that's a difficult thing to admit, because maybe you've spent 20 years trying to become successful. And now you're asking yourself whether success actually means what you thought it meant. Maybe you spent years being the person everyone could depend on, and now you're realizing that constantly putting yourself last has a cost. Maybe you became really good at keeping the peace, and now you're realizing that keeping everyone else comfortable has meant ignoring yourself. Maybe you built an empire identity around being strong, and now you're learning that strength doesn't mean you never needed support. These realizations can be uncomfortable because they challenge the story you've been telling yourself. But uncomfortable doesn't automatically mean wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply what happens when something familiar is being questioned. And that's why I don't want the return to be another place where somebody tells you, here's who you really are. Because I don't know who you really are. And neither does anybody else. That's something you have to discover. What I can do is give you a framework for asking better questions, for noticing patterns, for looking at the identity underneath those patterns, for recognizing where you may be living from old conditioning rather than conscious choice, and then eventually for deciding what you want to do with that awareness. That's what the return is about. It's about remembering who you are. And maybe the first question isn't, what should I do with my life? Maybe it's, what have I been taught to believe about who I am? Then ask yourself, which parts of that do I actually believe? Which parts have I simply accepted? What am I doing because I genuinely want to? And what am I doing because it's who I've learned to be? Those questions can take you surprisingly far, because sometimes the next step becomes clear once you stop trying to force yourself to have an answer. And I want to say something else. If you're in this place right now, please don't turn it into another reason to criticize yourself. Don't make feeling uncertain mean you failed. Far from it. Don't make not knowing your next step mean you're behind. Life doesn't always move in a straight line, right? Sometimes you reach a point where the old way of living doesn't make sense anymore, but the new way hasn't become clear yet. That's an uncomfortable middle, but it's still part of the process. You don't have to rush out of it. You can get curious about it. You can pay attention, listen. Start noticing what feels true and what feels like obligation. What gives you energy and what consistently drains you. What feels like you and what feels like a role you're performing. And you can begin right there. Okay? This is why stage 2 of the return is called the mirror, because before you can consciously change something, you have to be willing to see it. Not judge it, not shame it, just see it. The patterns, the reactions, the roles, the beliefs, the expectations, the ways you respond when you're afraid, the ways you respond when you want approval, the things you tolerate, the things you avoid, the things you keep repeating, because your life can give you information about the identity you're operating from. And the point isn't to blame yourself for every difficult thing that happens. That's not what I'm talking about. The point is to become curious about your participation in the patterns that keep repeating. What are you reinforcing? What are you accepting? What are you expecting? What are you afraid to question? That's a big one. What are you afraid to question? And also, what have you forgotten about yourself? That's an interesting one. What have you forgotten about yourself? That question brings us back to the very beginning. Maybe you're not lost. Maybe you've simply spent a long time becoming who you needed to be. And now you're at a point where you want to know who you are without all of that. Not because the person you've been was wrong. That person got you here. That person adapted, that person learned, that person survived experiences. That person found ways to belong. That person did the best they could with what they knew at the time. But you are allowed to ask whether those same strategies still belong in your life today. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to question. You are allowed to outgrow an identity, and you are allowed to not have the next answer yet. So if you're sitting there right now thinking, I don't know what my next step is, maybe don't start asking yourself what the next step is. Start a little closer and ask yourself, what feels like me? What matters to me now? What no longer feels right? What am I doing because I want to do it? What am I doing because I think I should? Where am I still performing? And where am I still seeking approval? And where do I feel most like myself? And you don't need to answer all of those today. Just start paying attention, because awareness changes the conversation. That is the return. Not becoming someone else, not creating a perfect version of yourself, not escaping your life, not finding some secret answer outside of yourself. It's remembering what matters, remembering what you've learned, remembering what you've adapted to, remembering what you've been carrying, remembering who you are, and slowly separating what is genuinely yours from what you simply learned to carry. That's a process, and it takes time, but it starts with one honest question. Who am I when I stop being who I was taught to be? Sit with that. You don't need to answer it immediately. Just let yourself become curious, because maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're at the beginning of finding your way back to yourself. And that is where the return begins. If this speaks to something you're experiencing, stay with me. We're going to explore this together. The patterns, the identity underneath them, the things we learn to become, and what happens when we finally become conscious enough to choose differently. So don't just watch this and move on to the next video. Take that question with you. Write it down. Sit with it. And if you're ready to go deeper, come join me on Patreon. That's where we're going to start doing the actual work together, the reflections, the workbooks, the deeper exploration. This is the return, remembering who you are. And if you're ready, I'll see you there.